Hey, beautiful souls, welcome back to Soul Stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to join our family. Stay with us, because a new love story is about to begin. The dust rose like prayers from the hooves of the horses as Colton Reeves guided the last of the cattle through the northern gate. The sun hung low over the Wyoming hills, painting everything in shades of amber and rust, and the air carried that particular silence that only comes at the end of a long day's work. He removed his hat, wiped his forehead with the back of his leather glove, and watched the animals settle into the pasture with the same detached attention he gave to everything in his life. At 34 years old, Colton had become something of a legend in Hollow Creek, though not the kind men brag about in saloons or women whisper about with admiration. He was the man who said no, the cowboy who refused every gesture of affection, every home-cooked meal left on his porch, every invitation to Sunday dinners, every lingering glance from widows and young women alike who saw in his weathered face and capable hands the promise of something steady and strong. Margaret Holloway had tried first, 3 years ago, arriving at his ranch with fresh apple pie and a smile that could have melted mountain snow. She was kind, genuinely so, with copper hair and gentle eyes that saw the good in everyone. Colton had accepted the pie because refusing it felt unnecessarily cruel, but when she suggested they might take a walk together sometime, he had simply shaken his head and told her she deserved better than what he could offer. She had left confused, the rejection sitting between them like a stone neither could move. Then came Elena Cruz, the schoolteacher who had moved to Hollow Creek from Santa Fe. She was brilliant and warm, with a laugh that filled rooms and a way of making everyone around her feel important. She had not been subtle about her interest, finding reasons to visit his property, asking him to fix things at the schoolhouse that did not need fixing, writing him a letter that he never answered. When she finally confronted him directly, asking what she had done wrong, he had looked at her with those gray eyes that held storms no one could name and told her she had done nothing wrong at all. That was the mystery that haunted the women of Hollow Creek. Colton never gave reasons that made sense. He never claimed to be in love with someone else, never mentioned a broken heart from his past, never pretended to be too busy or too poor or too anything. He simply refused, quietly and firmly, as if he had made some private vow that no amount of persistence could break. What they did not know, what no one in Hollow Creek knew, was the weight that Colton carried in the space between his ribs, where other men kept their hearts. They did not know about the fire that had consumed his family's ranch in Montana when he was 19, the fire that he had started by leaving a lantern burning in the barn during a windstorm. They did not know that his father had run into those flames to save the horses, or that his mother had followed to save his father, or that Colton had stood frozen in the yard, unable to move, unable to help, watching the two people who had loved him most disappear into a hell of his own making. He had never told anyone. The official report called it an accident, and perhaps it was, but Colton knew the truth that lived in his bones. He had been careless. He had been young and distracted and thinking about a girl in town rather than the responsibilities that came with running a working ranch. His carelessness had cost his parents their lives, and no amount of kindness from well-meaning women could change the fact that he had already taken enough from the world. He did not deserve to receive what he could never repay, so he built fences, both literal and metaphorical. He purchased the abandoned Reeves property in Wyoming, no relation to his family name but somehow fitting, and he rebuilt it with his own hands over the course of 5 years. He worked from dawn until his body ached too much to think, and he slept in a small room with bare walls and a single photograph of his parents that he could not bring himself to look at directly, but could not bear to put away. The autumn that changed everything began like any other. The leaves turned their familiar shades of gold and crimson, and the air grew sharp with the promise of early frost. Colton had hired temporary help for the season, as he always did, through an agency in Cheyenne that asked few questions and provided workers who needed paychecks more than conversation. He expected the usual assortment of drifters and ranch hands looking for honest work before moving on to wherever the wind took them next. What he did not expect was Josephine Marlowe. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a truck that was older than she was, with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and a quiet confidence that seemed out of place for someone who stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed perhaps 100 pounds soaking wet. Her hair was dark, almost black, cut short in a practical way that suggested she had little patience for vanity. Her eyes were the color of creek water in summer, somewhere between green and brown, and when she looked at Colton for the first time, she did not look away. When his gaze failed to soften in welcome, she had experience with cattle, she said, and with horses, and with the kind of hard work that most people only pretended to understand. She did not need special accommodations, and she did not need to be treated any differently than the other hands he hired. What she needed was a job and a place to stay for the season, and she would earn both without complaint. Colton hired her because he needed the help, and because something in her directness reminded him of his mother, though he would never admit that, not even to himself. He assigned her the northern pastures and the maintenance of the fence lines, work that kept her busy and far from the main house where he preferred to maintain his solitude. But solitude, he discovered, was harder to maintain than he expected. Josephine did not flirt with him. She did not bring him food or manufacture excuses to be near him. She worked her sections efficiently and well, asked practical questions when she needed answers, and spent her evenings in the small bunkhouse he had built for seasonal workers, reading books by lantern light that she borrowed from the town library. She treated him like an employer, nothing more and nothing less, and for the first few weeks, Colton found himself grateful for her professionalism. What changed was so gradual that he did not notice it happening until it had already happened. He found himself watching for her at the end of the day, looking for the cloud of dust that announced her return from the northern pastures. He noticed the way she hummed while she worked, songs he did not recognize but that settled into his memory anyway. He noticed that she never complained, even when the work was hard, even when the weather turned cruel, even when one of the horses threw her and she walked 3 miles back to the barn with a bruised hip and a determination in her eyes that made him forget, briefly, why he had built so many walls. One evening in late October, Colton was repairing a section of corral fence when Josephine approached him with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without ceremony and leaned against the fence beside him, watching the sun set in its usual spectacular fashion over the distant mountains. She said nothing for a long time, and neither did he. The silence between them was different from the silences he shared with other people, which always felt like space that needed filling, like absence that needed explanation. This silence was comfortable, the kind that exists between people who have nothing to prove. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. She told him about her father, a man who had drunk himself into an early grave after his business failed in Colorado. She told him about her mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and had died exhausted at 52, worn out by a life that had demanded too much and given too little in return. She told him about the years she had spent blaming herself for not being enough, for not saving the people she loved, for being a burden rather than a blessing. Colton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked why she was telling him this, and she said it was because she recognized something in him that she had seen in her own reflection for too many years. He denied it, of course. He said he did not know what she was talking about. He said he was fine, that he preferred to be alone, that he had simply made choices that worked for his life and his work. But his voice caught on the words, and Josephine heard what he was not saying with the same clarity that she heard what he was. The conversation might have ended there, another connection severed before it could take root, except that Josephine did something no one had ever done before. She asked him directly what he was running from, not what he was hiding. not what was wrong with him, but what he was running from, as if she understood that fear and motion were sometimes the same thing. He did not answer. He could not answer. But that night, lying awake in his small room with the photograph of his parents catching the moonlight through the window, he found himself wanting to answer, wanting to tell someone the truth that he had carried alone for 15 years. The wanting surprised him more than anything had surprised him in a very long time. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling. Josephine did not push, but she also did not retreat. She continued to work, continued to share occasional coffees and comfortable silences, continued to treat him like a whole person rather than a puzzle that needed solving. And slowly, piece by piece, Colton began to tell her the truth. He told her about the lantern, about the wind, about the moment he saw the first flames and knew, with a certainty that had never left him, that he had destroyed everything he loved. He told her about his father's voice shouting for him to stay back, about his mother's silhouette against the fire, about the collapse that turned everything he had ever known into ash and silence. He told her about the years afterward, the drinking he had done before he found this land, the jobs he had quit, the people he had hurt with his distance, because he believed he deserved neither their kindness nor their company. Josephine listened to all of it without judgment, without the platitudes that other people offered when they did not know what else to say. When he finished, when the last word had fallen into the space between them like a stone into deep water, she looked at him with those creek water eyes and said the words that he had never allowed himself to hear. She said he deserved to be loved anyway, not despite what he had done, not because time had passed or because he had suffered enough, or because he had earned some kind of redemption through his solitude and his work. She said he deserved to be loved anyway, in the same way that everyone deserves to be loved, because being human means making mistakes that cannot be unmade, and because refusing love is not penance but punishment, and because the people who loved him would not want him to spend his life as a ghost haunting his own existence. Colton did not know how to respond. He expected many things from confessing his secret, but not this. He had expected disgust, or pity, or the careful distance that comes when someone realizes they are standing too close to something broken. What he had not expected was acceptance, offered not as charity but as simple truth, as obvious and inevitable as the sun rising over the eastern hills each morning. That night, for the first time in 15 years, Colton wept. He wept for his parents, and for the boy he had been, and for all the years he had lost to a guilt that had become so familiar he had forgotten what life felt like without it. He wept for the women he had turned away, not because he wanted to, but because he believed he had to. He wept for the future he had been too afraid to imagine, the family he had convinced himself he did not deserve, the love he had refused because accepting it felt like betrayal. When the autumn ended and the season's work was complete, Josephine did not leave. She stayed through the winter, then the spring, then another summer that burned hotter than any Colton could remember. She stayed not because he asked her to, though eventually he did ask, but because she had found something worth staying for, and so had he. Their love was not the kind that poets write about, all passion and grand gestu. Res and declarations shouted from rooftops. It was quieter than that, built on early mornings and shared labor, and the daily choice to remain present when presence was difficult. It was built on the understanding that some wounds never fully heal, but that healing is not the same as forgetting, and that carrying something together is different from carrying it alone. They married the following autumn, in a small ceremony attended by the handful of people who had become their community, despite Colton's best efforts to remain apart from the world. Margaret Holloway came, surprisingly, and wished them both well with genuine warmth, and Colton finally understood that the kindness he had refused all those years had never been about what he deserved, but about what people wanted to give, freely and without expectation. The photograph of his parents found a new place on the mantel of the house that Josephine helped him rebuild, a house with more rooms than one person needed but exactly enough for the family they eventually became. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening, Colton would look at that photograph and feel something other than shame. He would feel gratitude and grief and the complicated love that survivors carry for those they have lost. He would never fully forgive himself. Josephine understood this and did not ask him to, but he had learned something that 15 years of solitude had failed to teach him, something that a small woman with creek-water eyes had known all along. Deserving love is not something that can be earned or forfeited. It is simply the truth of being human, offered to everyone equally, waiting only for those who are brave enough to accept it. And Colton Reeves, the cowboy who had refused every kindness for more years than he cared to count, had finally found the courage to stop refusing, to stop running, to stop believing that his Saint defined the boundaries of his future. He had found the courage to love and be loved anyway.